there's a difference between what like the best way objectively to do something is and the way you'll be best at doing something. Right? And I think people like conflate those things too often. Let's say objectively, right? Like a great way to build a medical tool is to, just do the research, chase this insurer route, get approved, and go through all of that. Say that's what it is. And I have caveats on that. Like, say that's the gold standard, right? It doesn't actually matter what the gold standard is if, like, that's not what you're going to be good at building, right? Like, the question for me was, like, am I going to be better than all these other people that are building here at, like, navigating insurer landscapes or, like, doing, large-scale academic research or any of those things? Like, I'm not. Like, I'm not going to be better than people who've done that for, like, 20, 30 years and are building products in that space. What I could be better at, right, is, like, can we build a better consumer experience? Can we build something people actually want to use?
Nikhil Patel is founder and CEO of Craniometrix, where they're using innovative deep learning and digital health tools to diagnose Alzheimer's disease and position themselves as the all-in-one Alzheimer's care platform. Nikhil studied computer science and economics at Yale University before launching Craniometrix, which was accepted into Y Combinator and have raised $6 million in their seed round. We talk about how Nikhil's been able to build Craniometrix as a 22-year-old and get investors really excited about his vision, how a digital tool can unlock new levels of diagnostic ability, and why Nikhil talks so fast. I hope you enjoy. So Nikhil, would you mind telling me a little bit about your story, particularly any pivotal moments along the way and how you got to where you are today?
Yeah, totally. So I've been in and around this, kind of Alzheimer's early detection research type space for a while. I think the first project I did in this space was back in grade 7. So I'm 22 now, so it's like 10 years ago. So when I was a kid, my grandma had Alzheimer's, and she was living out in rural India at the time. Slowly over the phone, she started repeating herself and those type of things. And so we brought her over to the States to try and seek treatment or see some doctors and stuff. Once all of that started to happen, and one of the main, roadblockers that everyone kind of cited for her was just that the condition was diagnosed super late. So, wanted to take a stab at solving that problem. Obviously, as a kid, nothing really fortuitous came for a while. Spent a couple years kind of tackling that myself. And then, spent a couple years doing research at a local university through high school, trying to really, understand, well, if I could look at my grandma and, tell that she has Alzheimer's disease or she has some form of dementia, maybe we could train a computer to do that identification much earlier. So, spent a few years in that space and had some interesting results and interesting publications come out of it. And then went to college, went to Yale, studied computer science and economics, and had this shift where, I saw some of those shiny things like the jobs in finance and all of those things that people get jumped into and ended up jumping over to go work in that space. What I found was that the machine learning type skills that I developed while building some of these predictive algorithms for Alzheimer's and all of that were super lucrative to some of these hedge fund bank type folks, and they were willing to pay me a lot of money to work on those problems for them. So I did that for a couple of years, and it was exciting. It was fun, but always kind of felt like something was missing. Wasn't super excited by the work and coming in every day. And so when I was coming up to graduate college, I started doing some thinking about whether I really wanted to kind of take this corporate job and go that way, or maybe if there was something that I could do that would be more fulfilling and maybe more impactful on the people around me. So at that point, kind of circled back to some of this research that I'd done back in the day and started looking into what was the state of the art today around Alzheimer's detection, those type of things. And was, pretty shocked to find out no one had actually effectively commercialized the tool. And so decided, why not take a stab at solving that problem? So, been working on building Craniometrix and building this kind of commercial set of Alzheimer's diagnostics and treatment tools for about a year now.
In terms of zooming in on the story a little bit, can you tell me about the process of building Craniometrix and getting into YC?
Yeah, absolutely. So back in the day, I'd done some pretty primitive research, basically saying, well, if we could take, you have people that do get diagnosed early with Alzheimer's or other dementias. It doesn't happen super often, but they do. If you can get a PET scan, you can get an MRI, you can get one of these very deep invasive procedures. You can get an early diagnosis. Obviously, super expensive, so it doesn't work for most people. So what I'd done back in the day was we'd taken folks that had gone through those procedures. Obviously taking folks that didn't have an early diagnosis and basically try to understand, well, at face value, at surface level, you can't really tell who has impairment, but like maybe if we put them through a series of these computerized tests, so we can really measure kind of fine cognitive processing skills, we can find something interesting. So back then, in terms of predictives, we're basically choosing kind of simple patient statistics and those type of things. So the first thing I did when I decided to start, Craniometrix and start this kind of corporate kind of commercial opportunity here was to just go back and take some of the data we've collected and build better models. Take a lot of the kind of machine learning and deeper predictive type skills that I picked up over the past few years and really say, well, can we build more accurate predictions off this pool of data we already had? So that was the first step. And we found that we can, and it's possible to kind of, approach accuracy rates of 90-95%. In comparison to what doctors are getting today off pen and paper tests, roughly 30% or so. So that was the first proof point. It was basically like, well, we can do this, and there, there's this interesting opportunity here. So the next step was to think about, well, like, what does that actually look like from a business perspective, from a startup perspective? Like, how do you build this into a product or a service that people want, right? And to that question, like, what should that look like, right? You could go the route of maybe there should be a tool that sits inside of a doctor's office, or maybe there should be a tool that, you do at your annual physical, those type of things. And so what we found in looking into this space was just that all of those bases were covered. I think there are a lot of other players that have been spending a lot of time on the side of, like, how do you build really accurate diagnostics, then bundle them into a physician's existing workflow. What we found was lacking was this idea of, like, how do you actually get people to use these things, right? Like, the average utilization for tools that are supposed to be used in the annual checkup is less than 30%. Like, these things aren't getting used. Doctors are overworked and don't have time to give people an extra 10-minute screen. So how do you build these in a way that people would actually take them? And we found, building a direct-to-consumer opportunity being the right way to go about that. And we've done that, and I was like, hey, well, this is a good idea that we could actually build a business on top of. And so I was at this point to, harken back to what I was saying earlier, where I was kind of trying to decide whether this was a viable, career opportunity to jump into, or whether I should, go the route that I had planned out and take a job offer. And so I spent a lot of time. I spent a couple of months, pitching the idea, refining the idea, and trying to raise money. Nothing worked for a few months. We got a couple of offers here and there, but nothing super lucrative or super attractive. And so by the time, July came around, and that, job offer was supposed to start, I ended up just kind of saying screw it and jumping all in anyway. Which I would say, to your point earlier about pivotal moments, probably the biggest jump I've ever made, in my life, ended up paying off. We ended up getting into Y Combinator that October. I think what folks really liked about our approach was just that idea of, how do you actually get people to use tools like this? And, like, why don't, other platforms exist in this kind of D2C space? And it seemed like an opportunity that allowed us not only build really successful diagnostics, but also to branch into a lot of other avenues of Alzheimer's care. So we did that, ended up raising a pre-seed round around, that's Y Combinator acceptance time as well. And went through YC this spring, winter-ish, January through March, and just closed the seed a couple months ago.
Nikhil, you're going to have to forgive me because I'm going to sound like a granddad throughout this. But the thing I don't understand is, so you go for this D2C approach where you're like, okay, doctors are doing this pen and paper tests. Why don't we make something that people can use probably in the comfort of their own homes whenever they want? I'm on a older adults geriatrics ward at the moment, and I look around, everyone has like a dumb phone, one of those flip phones. They don't know how to use touchscreens mostly. So I just don't understand how, you going for this approach makes any sense for that population. How did you square that?
Totally. Yeah. And so, it comes down to a couple of things. One is that we're really looking at wanting to be the earliest first check for these conditions. And we look at the age group for that, right? Like, we're really not looking to test people above 70 years old, right? Like, the target for, like, an early screen is really, can you get people and can you test them anywhere from, like, 45 to, like, early 60s, right? It's just kind of like very, very early step. And that's an age cohort, right, that, like, does have smartphones, like, does, use a lot of these services. And what you find, right, is that, like, that's where you can have the most impact, because if you're 75, right, and you don't have a cell phone, whatever, we can talk about that problem. Like, if you're 75 and, like, you don't already show symptoms of cognitive impairment, right, then even if you have early stage cognitive impairment in your brain, like, the impact of that's going to be very, very small, right? Because, like, these things take a very long time to play out. You're looking at wanting to catch these, anywhere from, like, 15 to 25 years before you actually see visible changes. So that early stage is just where we look to meet people, which is why, you you can do this feasibly, right? Because like if you're looking at that 45 to kind of 65 group, my parents are 60 and are well versed on their phones, and so that's what we try to get at. It's an interesting question though. I mean, we did some work with digitizing pens and those type of things and make it easier for some people to do these things. If you look at an older cohort, what we ended up settling on though was that one, we focus on this younger cohort. Most of these people already are well versed with technology, but two, it's kind of right. Like we're building a product that we want people to use for the next 40, 50, 100 years. Right? Like we want this to be a frontline detection that people continue to use in perpetuity. And so maybe, right, you have this 10-year lag where people on the very high end, you're like 65-year-olds today aren't well versed and aren't going to take this test, even though they should. But 5 years from now, that's no longer a problem, right?
But it sounds like you're building something that people will enjoy using a bit more or will use for the next 10, 20 years. Like what is it that actually your test entails that means that people will want to use it? Can you kind of fill me in on that?
Yeah, totally. So the testing suite is pretty simple. So like one of my favorite examples of one of the tests we offer is the digitized version of what's called the clock drawing test that I'm sure you're familiar with, but for everyone else, it's just basically this idea where you draw a clock on a piece of paper, and then a doctor looks at it and it's going to say, hey, well, did Nikhil draw all of the numbers or the hands pointing to the right numbers, et cetera? Basically, come to some conclusion about whether I have cognitive impairment or not. As it turns out, it's really, really difficult to do that accurately at an early stage. Accuracy rates of catching any type of cognitive impairment based off a clock drawing test before visible symptoms appeared is sub 30%, which makes sense. Like if you couldn't notice in a conversation with me, right, how are you going to notice, based on this clock? So what we do is on both the clock drawing test and on all of the other assessments we built is we focus not on what the final product was, rather like what can we learn from the way you completed a task, right? So what can we learn from like if you did draw all of the numbers, right? What can we learn from what's different about how you drew the 12, 3, 6, and 9 versus the other numbers that you added later? Like what can we learn from how many times you picked up your pen while drawing? Those type of features end up being really predictive. So what we build now, right, is and what we're building towards, right, is this idea that people take these tests on a recurrent basis. They take these, on a quarterly or biannual basis. So then we can really start to understand how you change. Because what's most impactful here, right, it's helpful to say, well, hey, how do you compare to your demographic group when you take this test once? But it's more impactful to say, like, how are you changing? And how is that rate of change different from the rate of change of other people? So we start with that. We start with this kind of ongoing diagnostic. And then, our goal is to lever that into how do we actually provide care along this continuum as well.
That's incredible. So instead of us having that kind of finite, that just end picture of the clock someone's drawn, we can actually get the information on how they did it and track that over time. And it also kind of reminds me of, in Capture, when you have to click, where the buses are.
Absolutely.
And it's not actually looking at your answer, right? It's looking at how did you get to that answer, because a robot will zip straight to it, but a human acts very differently. It's kind of similar, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. And I think that idea, right, is starting to permeate a lot of different aspects of medicine. I mean, even for us, like, we've done testing with, how do we use our tools to catch conditions like PTSD as well. And we've done research like, well, how can you use this as a tool on football fields, right, to identify when someone is safe to go back out or when they're, at risk for a concussion. And so there are a lot of really interesting ways to do this next level kind of abstraction of how do we understand how people use technology. And I think, we're building these products that are specifically targeted towards that. I think what's really interesting is like, how do you turn these into passive listening devices down the line, right? Like if we can do predictive based on how you're typing into a word processor. So like realistically, we can also do predictions based on how you're typing text messages or those sorts of things. And, it opens up a whole host of ethical complications at that point. But it's an interesting idea.
There's no real limit to what you can do with passive, right? Because, the studies into how your voice changes when you have COVID or in Parkinson's, the tone of your voice might change as well. So, it wouldn't just be mild cognitive impairment or Alzheimer's. There's so many things you could do.
Yeah, absolutely. Something we were toying with early on. And there are a host of reasons why we're focusing on Alzheimer's disease. One of the biggest ones being, just kind of my personal connection to it and prevalence of the condition in the family. But early on, we did some experimentation. Like, what if we just applied the same idea of what we built in some of these same predictives? Like, if I took a video, 5-second video of myself in the mirror saying something every day, becomes really interesting. You can predict colds, a couple of days before they happen. You can do all sorts of things. that we should be doing a lot more of.
The thing you've described so far is kind of an active test where you log onto your thing and you draw a clock, and then what you've kind of been hinting at that passive things are also interesting, things that are passively collected because you don't need that active participation every day to get the data, right? So what interesting ways are there of passively detecting stuff? Is it like monitoring the keyboard, monitoring your voice? Are there any other kind of good biomarkers?
Yeah. So, it's interesting. I think one, it's a tough question to answer just because it's going to be companies like Apple, et cetera, are well positioned to really understand, how do you passive listen and what are the best ways to do it. Based on, what we've done, it's things like, your keyboard on the phone. It's really interesting just to understand, like if someone's just playing a game, right? You can pick up a lot of the same signals as we do off the clock from gameplay, right? Like how quickly you're responding to new stimuli, how are you, moving the blocks, et cetera. So, for us, I think what we started with, right, is this almost, and it's, we call it kind of gamification and the way we've, built these clocks, those type of things. It's not really a game. No one's doing it for fun, right? But like, I think we started with this idea of like, the best thing to do is to take the existing medical standard and kind of build the same thing that works a lot better, right? And start to, build adoption in direct to consumer capacity and get people to understand like why these things work. And I think that gives you this foothold that allows us to slowly pivot to passive listening over time, right? Because like if we can make it more fun for people to do these things, right? And we're probably never going to get to the point where like this is entirely passive. You just kind of install it on your phone and let it run in the background. But we get to the point where you could put this behind like your Wordle, right, or behind your New York Times crossword, or those type of things. That's super feasible to do and easy to set up. And I think we get a lot of rich information from it. So hopefully, as we continue to build, we can shift consumers from these more active clock drawing type of things towards more passive, just like plug this behind a game and, you can do what you're going to do anyway, and we can learn something useful about your kind of cognitive capacity from it.
The other thing I don't get, though, is that you mentioned that this is mild cognitive impairment or Alzheimer's. It's more useful to be able to detect it or screen it between 45 to 60 or a slightly younger age. And I'm happy to be corrected on this, but my understanding was that a lot of the pharmacology and a lot of the interventions used in these kinds of things, they don't really reverse the disease. They might improve quality of life, but with a good screening program, you need like an intervention that's actually going to have a decent effect. So, I mean, do those things exist? Like, is there evidence that if you crack on early, that you're actually going to make a demonstrable difference in someone's life?
Yeah. So, it's a tough question to answer. I think we're in kind of the early stages of, treating conditions like this. For a long time, things as simple as kind of the lifestyle management change, those type of things, whether it's diet, exercise, have been shown to have, some positive effects on slowing the progression of the condition. To your point, right, we're never, for a long time, at least, maybe the next 50 years, whatever, we're not going to be able to reverse these conditions. We're not going to be able to, reverse damage to the brain. What we can kind of do now is slow the rate of damage. So for us, one of the main reasons for catching this early is like, well, today, right, as you start to go through these conditions, you have your fall risk person, you have your primary care person, you have all these different folks that are all helping kind of different parts of the journey, or different services that are helping different parts of the journey. And so for us, it's like, well, that's a super painful process for people to go through. Like, why not kind of centralize all the services and build a one-stop shop kind of care ecosystem around the condition? So for us, it's like, well, if you can catch this early, you're inevitably going to need a lot of services, whether those are prevention or treatment services. And we can kind of optimize how those are delivered, both for you and for your family caregivers and all of those folks.
There's an interesting collaboration or financial model where you could hook up with pharma and they're like, okay, we've got this new drug or current drug that's helpful in slowing down Alzheimer's, and we're going to partner with you. You spot people who have this and we advertise our drug to them, or maybe we enroll them in this clinical trial. Have you thought of those kind of collaborations?
It's a good question. So we actually, we've had multiple pharma companies reach out on that front. And I think, what's interesting for us from that space is like, how do you do that in a way that's most altruistic, right? From a pharma company perspective, incentive alignment is basically like, well, can we identify who's at risk and triage them to that pharma company, right? So that they maintain kind of price discrimination, all of those things. From our perspective, right, that's not as attractive. Like, our goal here is really like, how do we kind of democratize this experience? Like one thing that's super interesting for us from a pharma perspective, right, is if we can become this first lever, and then this first kind of sieve that's catching folks. Well, then as multiple companies start to come out with these drugs, right, we start to get the ability to build kind of a competitive marketplace, right? We have some say in how these things are priced and have the ability to triage people towards the right drug instead of just, whichever one they can find. And so, we try to be very cautious of that when working with pharma companies. But yeah, to keep it short, we've had a lot of interest there and have some traction with some of those folks. And we're kind of going through the early stages of doing some kind of partnership trials on that front.
If everything goes right for you over the next 10 years, like where do you see yourself and Craniometrix being? Like what's the 10x goal or the big fat vision? Like where would you be?
Yeah. To what I was mentioning earlier on kind of the point of like, what do you do if you can't necessarily, treat these things or cure these things? And that's becoming that one-stop shop care platform for Alzheimer's and other dementias, right? Like becoming the place people go when a caregiver has a question, right, or when a patient needs to take these recurrent cognitive assessments or wants to engage with digital therapeutics, which is another thing we're seeing a lot of really interesting traction on, across kind of the research landscape is digital therapeutics for treating these conditions. And so we want to be that one-stop shop for all of that, in addition to, right, whether it's provision of pharmaceuticals or kind of, synchronous consultations and all of that, and really, do all of that symptom management pathway planning. So what is interesting for us, as we think about the market as a whole, right, is like it's going to change a lot. Like for every piece of the Alzheimer's journey, from diagnoses to prevention to treatment, all of it, it's all going to change a ton over the next 10, 20, 30, 50 years. Like what we want to do is really just position as kind of that central consumer window into the space, right? So the position is kind of like the provider of care directly to consumers and individuals. And in that way, I think we have this opportunity to kind of evolve with whatever direction the industry goes, right? Like if we see a groundbreaking drug come out in 6 months, a lot of the platform becomes, how do we just funnel consumers towards that drug? And if we see a groundbreaking digital therapeutic come out, it becomes that instead, right? So, and I think that's where I see ourselves in 10 years. We want to be the place when someone starts to develop Alzheimer's or has a concern about dementia. We want to be the first place they come, and we want to be the only place they have to go through the entire life cycle of that disease.
Look, so Nikhil, you've got Indian origins, I've got Pakistani origins, and one thing I've picked up, growing up in the UK, is that a disease like Alzheimer's, which is so complicated and affects kind of every facet of someone's life and family life and social life. I'm going to generalize, but in the West, there isn't really that solid kind of support network and maybe that kind of looking after of older adults, and in some facets it's not really there. And I just wanted to ask, you're building this total platform that will hopefully address many of the needs these people will have. But at some point, do you just see that it's like almost too big of a problem to solve? Like there's certain things you can offer, right? You can offer certain interventions, but like how can you offer someone like a supportive social network and speaking to someone who loves them every day? Like, there's certain things that just seem too difficult for you to address.
Yeah. It's a really good question. It's a question of, I'm deeply passionate about outside of the lens of Alzheimer's as well. Look, like, I think there are a couple of things that happen. One of the things that's, crazy that I hear a lot from, when we're talking to people who, maybe have a parent going through Alzheimer's or one of those things, is like one of the reasons that, they don't pick up on it for a while is because like the person who has the condition usually knows, that they're in early stages of what's happening. They're starting to forget things and not remember as long. Something that's emblematic of the condition across the board is like parents start shortening phone calls, and instead of talking to you for 10 minutes, they talk to you for like 8 minutes or 7 minutes or 5, and it just goes shorter and shorter because they know that if they keep if they keep on the phone too long, they'll start repeating themselves, and like they don't want their kids to know that. They don't want to look weak or whatever it is. Like everyone does it, and it happens in a crazy amount of cases. I would say close to 30 to 40% of cases we talk to, like people, looking back and in hindsight, report that as something that happened, right? And that happens, I think when that's the only point of interaction you have with an elder family member. I think if you look at multi-generation households, whether it's in and across Asia or even kind of countries in Scandinavia, Norway is I would say doing a much better job than much of the West at doing multi-generational type stuff. As you look at places like that, where you have these much more frequent touch points with people, I think you have this ability to, catch conditions like this earlier anyway, right? Because like you just, you're around those folks. And in one way, that's what we can try to replace. It's like, well, we can try to even get earlier than you could catch it, talking to a parent or a relative every day, well, then you can solve that problem digitally. But I think the other thing that happens, right, is that like it's hard to say, right, but like to that point of kind of what do you do, right? It's a lot of people talk about those mental exercise. They're just kind of keeping yourself stimulated as a way to slow the progression of certain, not of Alzheimer's as a whole, right, but of certain symptoms of the condition. Importantly, some of the most prevalent symptoms, whether they be kind of short-term memory loss or those type of things, can be strongly, affected by those engagement and those type of things. And I think we've unfortunately, right, kind of built a society where older people are relatively siloed, right? You have people that are in their homes alone for essentially 24 hours a day, maybe go out once or twice a week. And so I think that's something you don't see as much in whether it's India or Pakistan, underneath these places where you live in these multi-generational households, right, where like you have your kind of oldest generation taking care of little kids, like all those things, right, that like everyone kind of works together and continues to stay engaged and involved in the community around them. As to how we fix that, right, I think it's a difficult question. I'm personally angel invested into a couple of startups doing interesting work in the US around multi-generational kind of housing and building that in a way that's not, it's obviously going to be very difficult to solve if you do it family specific, right? Like how do we start to replicate multi-generational living in kind of a community aspect, right? And so there's some really interesting companies doing work like that. And I think maybe that's a way we start to approach solving this problem. But it's tough. It's particularly tough just also in the way, in the way the U.S. is laid out, right? Like it's super easy in a lot of places in Europe or Asia to, walk outside your door and see other people and kind of engage in community. Not as easy when, you're living a 15-minute car ride from the nearest park, right? Or those type of things. And so you start to lose a lot of that kind of random interaction people used to have. And it's hard to say, I don't think the research is super clear on how how do we quantify the effects of that on prevalence of Alzheimer's and other conditions like that. But intuitively, feels like it's there. And in any case, it would at least be helpful to solve from the perspective of kind of symptom management and symptom aid.
Look, I've given you a really hard time, so I apologize, but I wanted to ask a super broad question, which was, when you speak to investors, clinicians, potential customers, can you give me a flavor of the kind of negative things they say about what you're building and the positive things as well? Like if you had to give me like a high level summary, what are those things?
Yeah, well, I mean, you hit one of them on the head, which we get a lot, which is that, like, what do you do, right? Like, hey, we catch this early. It's like, what do you do with that information? Super good question. Our usual take is the same as what I told you, which is, all right, there are a lot of these small things you could do. But regardless of like how much you can cure or treat this condition, it's a condition that takes a lot of work to get through and like takes a lot of resources and it's expensive. And so if there's just optimization you can do from a care perspective, right, then like there's a massive opportunity here. And people usually like that a lot, right? Which is that like for us, diagnostics, for me, altruistically, right, diagnostics are really helpful for like this idea of well, we can try to help people earlier and you can accelerate research, clinical research processes, all those things, right? So that's great. But also there's just the idea where like diagnostics are simply like a lead gen function for care, right? So like if we're talking about who's going to win, we spend close to $300 billion a year in the United States on Alzheimer's care, right? So it's like the question is like, well, who's going to win that space that today is super fragmented and has no kind of direct consumer provider? Well, then, catching this condition early for people and being that, first leg in is a great way to do that, right? Where, because it doesn't matter if I tell, if we catch the condition for you and we're like, hey, there's nothing you can really do for the next like few years. And hopefully we can try to help with X, Y, and Z, but we don't really know if any of that's going to be really effective. That's unfortunate that we have that gap there, but at least, right, when symptoms start to present, when you do need all of this help and you need to in-source nursing care and you need all these different consultations set up and you want those visual therapeutics and all of that, right, the person you're going to turn to is that first kind of player that you've had a relationship with for multiple years. And so that's what, I think people have really liked. And so it's funny. I think it's like both, it's kind of the same thing that people, hate and love, which is, they hate this idea of like, well, you can't really do anything immediately. And it's not, there's no clear cut science on what to do here. But then they love the fact that like you can use this diagnostic leverage just a way to win that care landscape. And I think in a lot of ways, right, it's something that sucks from like a real life perspective, but it's super interesting from a business perspective. It's just like I said earlier, we just don't know a lot about Alzheimer's disease at all. And we're going to learn a lot more, and we're going to learn a lot more about what treatments look like. And it's going to be a fantastic position to be in, right? Whether it's 3, 5, 10, 15 years from now, to have been, an established D2C provider of care. They can then kind of, wedge in any of these other solutions as well.
So my understanding of Y Combinator is that it's kind of like the Harvard for startups. And I wanted to ask, how did you get in, or do you think there's anything specific that you did that worked well for you? And secondly, could you give me a flavor of kind of any high level takeaways you had from it, or anything kind of that you learned from the whole process?
Yeah, absolutely. So, YC it's a fantastic program. I don't know if I love the Harvard of startups name. I went to Yale, so we have a little thing with the big H. But yeah, it was a great program. I think some of the things that people really like about us was just this this ability to early on demonstrate this wedge of like we have this interesting idea, and had this idea of like you should be able to build digitized diagnostics for Alzheimer's and dementias and all of that. And we had, coming into applying to YC in that September or whatever it was, we've been able to demonstrate some work on the fact that people actually want this, right? And, there are people that are willing to sign up and get on a wait list and those types of things. And so, I think what YC really liked was a couple of things. One, I think was the idea of like, this is just a massive problem in a massive space. And like, honestly, for a program like YC or similar, like for me, as I think about angel investing into really early companies, like it doesn't really matter what exactly you're doing right now. Like it doesn't matter what exact problem you're trying to solve within Alzheimer's, because if you look at it, it's a massive enough market and there are a ton of problems that need solving. So like if you have some experience in the space, then you'll be able to solve one of those effectively, right? And so I think YC like that, and like my kind of personal connection to the space. Although I guess to caveat that. We'll never really know what they liked or what they didn't like. To your second question about what the takeaways were, look, I think the biggest part of YC, I think there are two things. One is just the people that you get to go through this program with, right? So you get to go through with like a fantastic cohort of companies that are all solving super interesting problems, all in slightly different ways, right? And you get this kind of bundling of knowledge that doesn't happen in a lot of other places. Like for us, right, it's like when you want to solve really complex tech problems, right? And for us, the technical lift is super light compared to like when you talk to some of these back end like quantum computing companies that are going through YC, like those type of things, right? So like when you have questions on something like that, you can call one of those people up and they solved that ages ago. And instead of spending weeks trying to find a solution, you get it in 10 minutes. And similarly on the medical side, right? Like there are a lot of founder physicians going through YC who, had a lot of experience with what does the insurance landscape look like in the US? How do you think about approaching insurers and all those things? I knew nothing about. Relatively difficult thing to really learn about online because resources and documentation are scattered. But you call one of these people up and you get a lot of context and information very quickly. So so that I would say is the the biggest boon of the program. And one of the biggest takeaways that they teach you, right, is I think really just like go really, really quickly. And I think that's it's to me at the beginning, it's funny because at the beginning of YC, I was like, they say that in the first talk, and I'm like, oh yeah, whatever. Like we kind of all know that, intuitively. I think it makes sense. Like we should go fast if you can go fast. But YC does this really good job of like forcing you to do it, and building the structure in the program that like makes you set goals and makes you try to achieve those goals. Most importantly, one of the things that I thought was fantastic is they tell you to set goals that you're only 50% sure you're going to hit, which I had never done before. I think there's this intrinsic kind of shyness from setting goals that are too lofty because no one wants to fail, right? Particularly by their own standard. And so what YC does is they force you to set these 2-week goals, try to meet them. Honestly, I don't think I met any of our 2-week goals every 2 weeks. But by the end of the program, right, you're way further than you thought you would have been just by trying to really hit these heavy targets. And so I think that's a big thing that they do really, really well. And when you do it surrounded by everyone else who's doing it as well, everyone kind of leans in, everyone goes all in, and you get to feel this really exciting vibe that you don't get too many other places.
I want to make 2 observations. One is that you talk at like 3x speed. And the second is that you give off like a vibe or an energy that you're like an IQ 400 person. So that leads to the next question, which is, have there been any habits or ways you approach problems or just anything you think that's unique about you that's helped you get to where you are today?
Yeah. So it's funny, actually, something related to what you said about me speaking really quickly. It's a comment I get all the time from a lot of people. And what you'll find, actually, it's interesting in pitching investors, right? I got a lot of feedback early on from investors who are like, oh, like you talk too fast, like those type of things. And I try to fix it. Sometimes what I found, right, what was super interesting is like, if you look, we ended up raising $6 million as our seed round. If you look at almost every one of those investors, one of the things that they said that, they just loved was essentially that, right? Like, if you are excited about the problem you're solving, you naturally, speak a little quicker, and that excitement comes through. And that was a part of what everyone liked. So I kind of, I used to try to slow myself down and all of those things. But what I found is like investors that don't care or people that don't care are going to zone out whether you're talking really quickly or not. and people that do care will try really hard to be a part of it. And you can transfer a lot of that excitement to other folks. But that being said, one thing that has been super useful for me is I like to write essentially as many things as I can. Like I would much rather for anything important, and this is something I hated doing through school and through college. But now it's something I try to do all the time. So like, instead of putting together a PowerPoint for a presentation to the team or to speak with somebody, and I have the team do this as well, it's that we write things. We write like a 2 to 3 page thesis on some perspective, right? Whether it's like, it's like, what should we do? What should we be building? Like, what should come next, right? Or like, who should we hire? Like, what type of person should this be? Even on to specific people, right? Like, we have this really, sometimes we have cases where we're interviewing now and like, all of perspective on somebody. And our CTO will have a different perspective on somebody and we'll both write a 2 to 3 page paper on what we think. And we'll read through those together. And there's something really valuable, I think, in laying out an argument, in the way that you have to when you write it down, that it isn't required in the same way in like a PowerPoint or those type of things. And I think there's something cool about like when you write, the only thing that can possibly shine, right, like is your argument, and that sometimes gets obfuscated when it's in a PowerPoint or when you're speaking or those type of things. So that what I would say is one of the new habits, at least through all this startup stuff, that's been super helpful.
It's interesting you mention about talking fast and how traditional advice says not to, and investors were saying that, because I've long had a feeling that a lot of traditional public speaking advice is kind of bullshit. It's like, speak really slowly, like a TED speaker, outline your points at the start, have a conclusion at the end. And any good speaker that I witness, when I see someone who's really good at speaking, I don't think they follow any of that.
Yeah, super interesting. I guess to me, it's like, if I look back on any of the interesting speakers I've ever heard, right, like, I don't know that I could tell you very many salient points from like what they said, but like I could tell you like how I felt afterwards or kind of the vibe I was left with. And I think that's a huge part of public speaking, probably the most important part of public speaking, which is how you feel, right? And one of the ways that comes through is that, whether it's the speed or the excitement or whatever it is, and it's definitely slept on. Like you said, like I have a lot of that's one of whenever founders that come and ask for advice on fundraising or whatever it is now. That's one of the things I said. Honestly, people talk fast. I tell them to keep doing it. And if people talk slow, I tell them to just kind of kick it up a notch and get some more of that excitement in there.
So this next question is kind of 2 questions rolled into one, but they're loosely linked. And it was basically that the opposite of the question I just asked. So are there any things about you, any habits or any ways you act that are like bad, but you've got through life with them? And loosely related is, along your journey in building Craniometrix, has there been any advice that you've received that you've just thought is not very good?
Yeah. It's a good question. So I think one of the things that has permeated my life in general is like, I definitely was always growing up type of kid who's like, doing homework on the bus on the way to school, and like, trying to write in some final answers while the teacher was picking it up and all of those things. And like, so it was just, that because I was always like behind on things and always kind of slow and always somehow, it ended up, working out. I think in hindsight, everything works out, right? But like I always kind of, got things done. And I always did best when I felt like there was kind of a fire under me. And so that was a really bad habit growing up for sure. But it's interesting in a startup space where like it actually works pretty well. But like, there's kind of always fire under you, right? And like, there's always like something. There's always like a customer asking for something else, right? And like, there's always, there are all these different things that are constantly burning. And so it lends itself well to that when there's always things to do and always things to get done.
Awesome. And the other question was there any advice you got along the way? Like maybe that was your advice, but was there any stuff that people have recommended that you thought is not very good along your journey?
Yeah. I mean, I'll say like people have, so like in medicine, I think people have established views on like just how they think the system should work. We get a lot of people that will tell us, we get investors who will say like, oh, like, this would be really interesting for us to entertain once you've, built insurance partnerships or gone down, that line and all of that. And we really don't want to do that at all. I don't think we want to, people will say that. People also say like, well, you should, you can kind of go the route of like, how do you integrate this with physician practice, right? Or become that tool that sits inside of offices. I think people give a lot of advice, that makes sense from the lens of like, well, how was medical tooling done, like 10 years ago, or like how are these things built, or how did people achieve scale with tools? And now we're in a really interesting space, in medicine in general, definitely accelerated by COVID, where you have this opportunity to build really interesting, like pure consumer plays, around the space and build tools that like solely go straight to people at home. And at least to start for us now, we're like cash pay. And I think that works really well because like, one, no one else is doing it. There are a lot of other people that are doing, how do we build for, pure like value-based care infrastructure, those type of things. And that's interesting. We obviously want to do that eventually. But like what we think makes way more sense is like, well, if you build a really interesting consumer opportunity first, you can build it to a scale where like, you can collect all of the data while doing it. Did it make the insurance companies will sign on to like a value-based payment plan, those type of things. Whereas what most other folks are doing is, they're raising money and then spending that money on a lot of trials and research and data collection, which is fine. But, we just think, an approach that's slower and more expensive and there's no reason to really take. So we get a lot of people that like want us to go kind of a more traditional route here. And then we find some people that like really love the differentiated perspective we're taking, like all of the investors we brought on board, et cetera. So that I would say is the piece of advice that we haven't taken, or that I thought was, pretty bad. It makes sense, for some people, and it makes sense for some skill sets. But like one thing that I think is important for founders to think about in general, right, is like, there's a difference between what like the best way objectively to do something is and the way you'll be best at doing something, right? And I think people like conflate those things too often. You could say objectively, right? Like a great way to build a medical tool is to, just do the research, chase this insurer route, get approved, and go through all of that. Maybe say that's what it is. And I have caveats on that. Like say that's the gold standard, right? It doesn't actually matter what the gold standard is if like that's not what you're going to be good at building, right? Like the question for me was like, am I going to be better than all the other people that are building here at like navigating insurer landscapes or like doing, large scale academic research or any of those things? Like I'm not going to be better than people who've done that for like 20, 30 years and are building products in that space. What I could be better at, right, is like, can we just build a better consumer experience? Can we build something people actually want to use? And so that was kind of, a big inflection point for us. We was like, a lot of people give you this advice of like what they think is objectively the best. And you have to caveat a lot of that with just like, what are you actually going to be best at?
I hope you enjoyed that episode. You can find all my links by going to bigpicturemedicine.co.uk. And if you've been enjoying the podcast, then please consider leaving a review on Apple Podcasts. And by the way, some of these episodes are now available in video format on Spotify and on YouTube. Thanks for listening.